Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to discuss the Sicilian variation. It is one of the most popular openings in chess and is one of the most fighting openings from black side against e4. I'll try to explain as much as possible both from the white side as well as black side. It starts with white playing e4 and black replying c5. Now there are many ways white can respond to the Sicilian defense. The main variation or the open Sicilian is when white plays knight to f3, planning d4. Other possible variations for white include knight c3. In fact, let's cover the sidelines first before jumping onto the main line, which is huge. So for knight c3, black can respond by playing knight c6. In closed Sicilians, white usually fianchettos his bishop with g3, g6. This is the main line for black too. Black fianchettos his bishop, castles on the king side, and so on. Bishop g2, bishop g7, d3, d6, and white develops his knight to e2. White prefers e2 instead of knight f3 because eventually in future he might want to play f4, but then his knight is obstructing the f4 move by being on f3. So more preferred here is the knight e2, e6, planning to develop the knight to e7. Black can also play knight f6, but knight e7 is more commonly seen because when white eventually plays f4, black would want to prevent white from pushing f5 by playing f5 himself. So black would like to play or develop his knight to e7 in that case. So for knight e6, white would castle, knight g e7, bishop e3 with the idea of d4. So to prevent that, black plays knight d4. From here, the game usually continues with white planning to play queen d2 and maybe exchange his bishops with bishop h6 after queen d2, and also maybe push f4 eventually in the middle game and then plan f5. Another idea would be to play the queen to d2, knight to d1, and then push this pawn to c3, pushing this knight away from d4. So these are the ideas from white. The plans for black involve moving the rook to b8, I would say, and then planning b5, expanding on the queen side and gaining more space or potential on the queen side attack. So that's the closed Sicilian. Let's jump back to other variations. So this is the main line. Let's look at the Alapin variation, which is c3. It is seen less frequently than the open or closed Sicilians, but nevertheless one of the important variations. Possible continuation for black is d5. So instead of d5, knight f6 is another possible continuation for black. But for d5, white can take ed5, black can capture queen d5, d4, knight f6, knight f3, e6, bishop e2. This is all the opening line, and I'll be continuing to go in more detail, maybe in individual videos, but this is kind of just an overview of the Sicilian defense, so I just wanted to give you an overview of it. And c6, castles. Now before black develops his bishop to e7, he would want to capture this pawn because he does not want to move his bishop, and if white captures this pawn eventually, he wouldn't want to capture it with the bishop again, losing the tempo. cd4, cd4, bishop e7, knight c3 attacking the queen. Black plays queen d6. Now, even though if it seems like white gets a tempo by playing knight to b5, black can go back to queen d8 and he will win the tempo back eventually by playing a6. So let's say white now plays bishop f4, threatening knight c7 fork. Now black can prevent it by playing knight to d5, bishop g3, and then a6. If white goes back to knight c3, black can castle. This is a pretty common position in the Alapin variation, and the white's ideas here would be to occupy the c file with rook c1, and then maybe play a3, trying to maneuver his bishops to bishop c4, bishop a2, and then bishop b1, eventually getting his queen to d3, lining up the bishop and queen in this diagonal, attacking on the h7 pawn. So that would be one idea for white here. Another idea also is if he gets a chance, he would like to push to d5, trying to exchange his isolated pawn away, and that way he gains more space and mobility for his pieces. And black's ideas, on the other hand, would be to maintain and control as much as possible the d5 square and expand on the queen side. So if possible, he should try to exchange as many pieces and reach the endgame where the isolated pawn on d4 might be a weakness for white. So this is as far as we can go on the Alapin variation. Now let's turn our eyes back to the main variation, that is knight to f3. So this is the main variation, and people who love to play dynamic games choose this over the other things because they're much more passive than this one. And here there are many ways that black can continue from here. One of the main variations is knight c6. Now this will convert to either Sveshnikov or the classical. Don't be worried about all these names. We will look at each of those one by one. And then other variations here would be to play d6. So d6 is one of the common variations too. It will result in a dragon variation or the Najdorf. So for d6, white plays d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, g6. Now this is the dragon variation. If black doesn't play g6 but instead plays a6, that would be the Najdorf variation. Let's look at the dragon variation first. So for g6, white can play bishop e3. This will be the famous Yugoslav attack, which is very dynamic. Both sides have their own equal chances, and white will try to attack on the king's side because black will eventually castle on the king's side, and black in turn will try to attack on the queen's side by pushing his pawns, developing his pieces, and lining up on the queen's side. So for bishop e3, instead of bishop e3, white can also play bishop e2. This is another variation. It can be played in both for dragon or for Najdorf as well, and they result in similar positions, except that this bishop is fianchetto for black in dragon, whereas in Najdorf it's developed to e7. So if white plays bishop e2, black can play bishop g7, castles, castles, bishop e3, and pretty much an equal position, I would say. This is a common line for white too. If he doesn't prefer such a dynamic position with opposite side castlings, he can choose this quieter line. And both have got equal chances in this line too. So let's go back to where the dragon started. So for g6, so here if black plays g6, it's the dragon variation, and white can respond with bishop e3, the famous Yugoslav attack, bishop g7, f3, castles. So here I would like to give you a quick note of a small trap. So for bishop e3, there is knight g4, which is attacking this bishop and is worth considering if not for this trap. Most of the beginners who are not aware of this trap might fall for it. So if black plays knight g4, then there is this bishop b5 check. Now black doesn't have a good move at all because knight c6 would lose to knight c6. b6, bishop c6, and you have both the check and the rook that are being double attacked. And if not knight c6, black cannot play knight d7 because white would capture this knight, and also there is no bishop d7 as well because it's pinned. This bishop is pinned and white can still capture this knight. So knight g4 is a bad move, and you should be cautious of that or be aware of it to take advantage of it. So here, instead of playing knight g4, if black plays bishop g7, that's the main line, the dragon variation. Now white plays f3. There are two reasons for that. First, he's defending the e4 pawn. He's also preventing knight g4. Now, why should he prevent knight g4 in the next move? Is because he wants to play queen d2, and if white moves his queen to d2, there is nothing that's attacking the knight on g4, so black can happily play knight to g4. So one way of preventing it is by playing f3, which happens to be the main line. So for f3, black can castle. White can continue his plan with queen d2, trying to exchange these bishops at some time in the future. And black can respond with knight c6, bishop c4. This is a main Yugoslav attack, and it's pretty common with all these moves. Bishop d7, long castle, rook c8, and as you can see, the kings are oppositely castled, and there are lots of different possibilities here. White usually plans to attack on the king side by pushing his pawns over, whereas black plans to bring his knight over to c4 and maybe push pawns on the queen side, attacking on the queen side. And it'll result in highly dynamic positions with a lot of tactics in the air. So if you love attacking the king and then love facing the dynamic positions, then this might be the line for you from both sides, I would say. Okay, so that's dragon. And let's go back to our beginning position where the open Sicilian started. So for knight f3, now we also saw dragon. Now let's see the Najdorf variation. So d6, d4, cd4, nd4, nf6, nc3. Here, instead of playing g6, if black plays a6, that's the Najdorf variation. And it's one of the main lines too, and both get equal chances in this line as well. White plays bishop e3. The idea is that white can continue the same patterns as he did in the dragon variation. He can decide to play bishop e3 and then maybe f3, queen d2 and triple castle, or he can also play bishop e2, bishop e3 and then castle on the king side. So for bishop e3, the only difference between Najdorf and the dragon variation is black would develop his bishop to e7. So he plays e5, knight b3, bishop e6, f3, bishop e7, queen d2, castles, long castle, and bd7. This is all just the line for Najdorf, the main line. And similar to dragon, here both sides have castle on the opposite side, and the attack would be pretty obvious. White would try to attack on the king side, whereas black would try to attack on the queen side. So pretty much a very dynamic position as well. So that's the Najdorf. Another thing you should be aware of among the main lines is the Paulsen variation. So the Paulsen variation is when black plays e6 in the second move, and white continues with d4, cd4, nd4, a6, preventing maybe knight b5, knight c3, queen c7, White can develop the bishop to e2 or to d3. Bishop to d3 turns out to be the main line, although I don't see much difference. Mostly white would still castle on the king side, but with the d3 bishop, I think there would be more potential for an attack on the king side with the h7 pawn and all that. So knight f6, castles, knight c6, maybe planning knight e5, then bishop e3, knight to e5. Now white wouldn't bother moving this bishop away because the advantage of double bishop is not that much in this position. In fact, if black captures knight takes bishop, white can take it back with the pawn, and that would defend the pawn on e4, and it would also prepare for more attack on the king side without worrying about any attack on the e4. So white doesn't need to worry about giving this bishop away for the knight. So for knight e5, white can play h3, maybe preventing knight to either of these knights to g4 attacking this bishop. So black can just develop his bishop to c5, king h1, planning f4, d6, f4. Black can go back to knight g6, queen e1, castles, and if white plays f5, black still has knight e5, and even if white comes queen h4, black can play b5. So you can see that white still tries to attack on the king side here, whereas black tries to gain the same initiative on the queen side. So Sicilian is pretty decisive game, I would say. I mean, although there are many draws in here, it's mostly at the grandmaster level, but usually around international masters and all of that, most of the outcomes are decisive. So if you're playing black and you would want to have an attacking and exciting game, then Sicilian is the best thing to choose. Okay, so you have also seen Paulsen. Let's go back and look at a couple more main lines in Sicilian. So for knight f3, there is knight c6. This is one of the other mainline variations. Now this can turn into either the Sveshnikov or the classical variation. So for knight c6, white can play d4, cd4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3. Here if black plays d6, then it's called the classical variation. Black can also play e5 here, and that is called the Sveshnikov variation. We'll look at it in a minute, but let's look at the classical variation first. So for d6, bishop g5, this is one of the main lines and it's called the Richter-Rosser attack. So black responds by e6, queen d2, a6. This is one of the main lines, and in this line black usually plans to keep his king in the center and try to attack on the queen side where white castles. There is also another passive line which is bishop e7, and black plans to castle on the king side itself. So bishop e7, white can castle on queen side, black castles on king side, f4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, queen a5. From here black can continue to play bishop d7 and maybe bring his rook to c8 and push a6 and b5 later when he gets a chance. White on the other hand can develop his bishop to c4 and plan for e5 in future. So as you can see, castling on the queen side, king side, is a little more passive line than leaving it in the center. Leaving it in the center leads to more dynamic positions. So let's go back and look at that variation too. This is the Richter-Rosser attack. So for bishop g5, we have e6, queen d2, a6, queen d2, a6, and white can do triple castling. bishop d7, f4, and b5. So if white decides to take this knight, which he will at some point of time because it has no good position after playing to bishop h4 or bishop f2, and the bishop is not really doing anything on g5, so he'll take this knight at some point of time, and black captures with the pawn. So this is one of the main lines in the classical variation. If white just moves king b1, black can play queen b6. And this is kind of a typical position in the classical variation. Black's ideas here would be to put more pressure and attack on the queen side. He usually does not castle, as I said, he would leave the king in the center. And white's ideas would be to exploit the king in the center by trying to open up the center, or maybe try to break the pawn structure by playing f5. So as you can see, this is a dynamic position and both have equal chances of winning. So that's the classical variation. Let's go back and look at the Sveshnikov variation. So here, if black plays e5, that's the Sveshnikov variation. The knight is attacked, so the knight has to go somewhere, and db5 is the best choice here, which is also the main line. Now white plans to check the black king by knight d6. So of course black prevents it by playing d6. Bishop g5, pinning the knight and planning to play knight d5 at some point of time. And also white would plan to capture the knight in future, because this is the knight that's controlling the d5 square, and white will have a more powerful knight if he doesn't have this knight in the way. So bishop g5 is a nice move to play. Bishop g5, a6, knight a3, b5, threatening b4. Now there are two variations here. White can play knight d5, or white can also play bishop f6, and that's also a main line too for bishop f6, and in which case black continues by playing g takes f6. Taking with the queen is a bad idea because you will be giving the tempo away for white to play knight d5. So for g f6, white can still play knight d5, bishop g7, c3, and f5. And it's a dynamic position with a volatile center. I would say black would eventually castle on the king side, and based on the position he can decide if he wants to capture the e4 pawn with fe4, or maybe play f4 and then play f5. So in either case he'll be putting a lot of pressure on these two squares, and if he gets a chance he will try to remove this outpost and try to plan d5 eventually, or exchange this knight away by playing knight e7. So those are the ideas for black mostly: get the knight to e7 and maybe the bishop to e6, attacking and putting more pressure on these two squares. So white on the other hand tries to consolidate his control over the d5 square by getting his knight to c2 and then to e3, and he will try to maybe expand on the queen side by playing a4, breaking the pawn structure, creating more weaknesses on the queen side. So that's the Pelican variation. So I've tried to cover most of the things here, just an overview of the Sicilian. I'll try to create more videos which are specific to a certain opening, and we can go in more detail there. So that's about it for now. See you guys in future videos. Thank you. Bye-bye.